Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, as I'm sure you've guessed by the title of this video and the poll I set up last week, we'll be discussing Ben 10 Alien Force. Now, before we begin talking about my feelings towards Ben 10 Alien Force, I'd like to discuss why I made this series of Ben 10 videos. You see, the reason why I've been making this series of Ben 10 videos is to go over my thoughts on each of the series in retrospect to when they release. However, as I'm sure some of you have noticed by now, most of these retrospective videos I've been making are just me talking about some of the things I liked and disliked about each individual series. Now, to be fair to myself, the reason why I've been doing it that way is because I kind of realized the things I liked about each series when I looked back on them. As at the time, I didn't really think very fondly of Omniverse or the reboot, but when I went back to them years later, I ended up finding a lot of things I enjoyed. Whereas when I did the same with Alien Force, I ironically didn't like it as much as when I first watched it. So basically, in retrospect, Omniverse and the reboot are a series I greatly enjoyed, whereas Alien Force in retrospect is a series I didn't really enjoy. But is that all I have to say about Alien Force? That it's just a bad sequel in retrospect? Well, no. I'm not going to be doing that. In fact, I actually want to go over that whole bad sequel thing I mentioned, and why I thought that at the beginning of my YouTube career, and how my view on that has changed a little bit in retrospect. You see, I think Alien Force has sadly become seen as just a sequel to the original Ben 10 series, rather than seen as its own unique thing. Now, yes, just so we're clear here, because I know that statement sounds super confusing, Alien Force, despite any retcons and inconsistencies people like myself point out, is indeed intended to be a canonical sequel to the original series. That's not what I'm trying to get at here. Rather, I think viewing Alien Force strictly as a sequel is the problem here. Again, I know I sound like I'm talking in circles, so let me try and get more concrete here. You see, nowadays, even though the definition of a sequel hasn't legally changed, I feel like people in general think of sequels in a very different way as opposed to what they used to think of it back when Alien Force first released. Entire movies now are set up solely with the anticipation of creating a sequel movie so they can become a franchise with numerous successive installments. As you can imagine, this has had an effect on the writing of said movies and sequels. Now they're much more planned out, and oftentimes, if the sequels don't happen, the original movies feel a lot less well thought out and don't make as much sense. The best example I can think of these kinds of things are when like a superhero movie has a post-credit scene that never gets picked up again. It just feels weird because now that scene doesn't really make sense, even though it was kind of set up by the movie. Now, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, this wasn't how movie sequels were handled back in 2008 when Alien Force first released. Sequels were things that had continuity for sure with their original/first installments, but were oftentimes entirely separate stories. They didn't really have the character development of something like a book, where you could really piece together individual moments that clearly affected a person that caused them to change their whole character. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that while these movies weren't devoid of character arcs, they oftentimes didn't overlap the way modern day movie sequels do. The only real good modern day example I can think to show you guys about what I'm talking about is the Fast and Furious movies. Yes, those movies are all in the same continuity. That's not up for debate here. But those movies are all their own individual stories with their own individual themes and character arcs, and are oftentimes written by entirely separate people with entirely different ideas about where to take the series. They're not meant to be seen as one long journey, but rather just moments in these characters' lives, and the characters themselves are rather flat in order to accommodate for this, so that way they never feel too far different from what they were originally, so that way we the audience can still recognize them, but they're also not totally the same, so that way the sequel doesn't feel repetitive or like it's retreading old ground. But anyways, getting back to the main point here, I feel like Alien Force was very clearly evocative of the older style sequel, but unfortunately nowadays, it's being sold as a kind of modern day MCU style sequel, where it's continuing Ben's character arc right from where it left off. And the reason why I think this is so damaging is because it invites comparison with the classic series, and comparison is the thief of joy. Don't believe me? Just look back at my video that I first made about Alien Force. I was mostly just comparing it to the classic series and pointing out how it wasn't exactly the same. Why did I feel that way? Because I too got sold on this idea that Alien Force was like the MCU sequel, the Avengers or Avengers Endgame sequel that would perfectly set up and tie together the classic series Ben, his character, and his universe in a way that heightened the classic series and Alien Force at the same time. But that's not what Alien Force is trying to be. It's trying to be its own unique thing that still pays homage and ties into the classic series, but mostly goes off in its own direction. And in today's video, I want to talk about Alien Force's unique direction and some of the things it added to the series that have now become staples of the franchise. This is where the whole retrospect thing I talked about at the beginning comes into play, because I believe in retrospect, some of the things Alien Force added to the series have become even more iconic than the classic series itself. Kind of like how Fast 5 or Mission Impossible 4 are more widely remembered than even their original movies are. That's right, dear viewer, this is a positive review of Alien Force. So now, without further ado, let's dive into the first iconic piece of memorabilia that Alien Force added to the series lore: Alien X. Alien X has become a slightly notorious figure within the Ben 10 community in the past couple years. Pretty much any time any matchup between Ben and another fictional character is made and people ask the question of who would win, Ben 10 fans immediately respond with, "Oh, Ben would win because he has Alien X." Anytime someone asks aloud what's Ben's unique and or most powerful transformation, Ben 10 fans say it's Alien X. Alien X has become so notorious and infamous within the Ben 10 community that I'm sure many outsiders looking in probably just think he's some extremely overpowered alien that the fans like to hype up. And while I understand the sentiment, because yes, Ben 10 fans do like to do that, Alien X actually is pretty interesting, or at least was in his initial debut in Ben 10 Alien Force. You see, in his initial debut in Ben 10 Alien Force's finale, Alien X was actually pretty interesting. You see, in said finale episode, we learn that Alien X isn't just one being, but rather two separate entities that both control it and act as one. These two beings are eternally deadlocked in an argument due to their differing personalities, which essentially deadlocks the transformation, making it extremely hard for Ben to actually use Alien X in that episode because he has to convince these two very different and very chaotic personalities to do what he wants them to do. I love this aspect of Alien X for so many different reasons. The first reason being that Bellicus and Serena, the names of the two individual personalities I just mentioned earlier, kinda remind me of a young Ben and Gwen from the classic series. They bicker and argue due to their differing views on things, much like how classic series Ben and Gwen argued for very similar reasons. I mean, heck, Bellicus is basically just a young version of Ben, an extremely hot-headed and quick to anger, argumentative brat. And while Serena is more calm like Gwen was in the classic series, she's also just as argumentative and stubborn as Bellicus, much like how Gwen from the classic series was. I know that this most likely wasn't intentional on the writer's part, but I can't help but appreciate the fact that Ben has basically now been forced to take the same role Grandpa Max did in the classic series, and make peace between two separate entities that act like the bickering children he and Gwen used to be, in order to fully access Alien X's power. But what does any of that have to do with what I was talking about originally, about Ben 10 Alien Force being a more traditional sequel and less so an MCU style sequel? And how does Alien X help me personally view Ben 10 Alien Force as its own thing, quote unquote? Well, you see, dear viewer, much like how after Fast and Furious 5, no one expected the Fast and Furious movies to go back to being about street races, and how after Empire Strikes Back, nobody saw Star Wars as just some action-adventure movie, but instead saw it as a deep family drama with crazy twists and turns in its plot. So too do I believe that the introduction of Alien X and Ben 10 Alien Force forever changed audience expectations of Ben 10. You see, with the introduction of Alien X, Ben Tennyson switches from a more Spider-Man or Billy Batson-inspired character to a more Superman-esque character, someone who has to figure out how best to wield their immense power, and when to wield it, and when to act as a diplomat. Now, yes, I know Ben never uses Alien X again to scare or try and fix the hybrid, but I'd argue it's the idea that something as powerful as Alien X resides in the Omnitrix that makes this comparison to Superman more understandable. Basically, to sum up all of what I'm trying to say here, I think that Alien X's introduction permanently cemented this version of Ben Tennyson into fans' minds. As well, yes, in the first couple of episodes he is different from his original series character. I feel like we as viewers never really got a clear indication of why that was, or rather, why the writers did that and what they were planning on doing with this new character until the Alien X episode. Because it's not until then that Ben is truly forced to act as a kind of diplomat. I'm sure some people are going to quickly point out the Dragon episode to kind of call me out, but I'd argue that even if the Dragon episode is still having Ben act as a diplomat, it still isn't nearly as iconic as the Alien X episode is. Now yes, that's mostly because Alien X himself is in there, but I'd also argue that as a finale, it marked the shift from just fighting the bad guys into trying to figure out a way to beat the bad guys, as season 2 would show us during the Rhiney episode, which in my opinion is the best episode of Alien Force. But anyways guys, let's move on to the next thing Alien Force added to Ben 10 that I'd argue has become even more iconic and synonymous with the series than anything from the classic series was: Professor Paradox.
It's so hard to tell, Ben. Have we met?
How do you know my name?
Have we met yet, I suppose the question was.
Now, before I get into what I love about Professor Paradox, let me once again go back to talking about Alien Force being its own thing, or a sequel more akin to that of the Fast and Furious and Mission Impossible sequels. That is to say, a sequel that acts as a kind of reboot and as a continuation at the same time, in order to allow new audience members to jump in and not worry so much about continuity, unlike an MCU-style sequel would. I believe Paradox in this series serves the role of iconic fan-favorite character that gets introduced in the sequel and quickly becomes an iconic part of the entire franchise, like Paul Walker's character in Fast 4, or Ethan Hunt's wife from Mission Impossible 3, or Yoda from The Empire Strikes Back. These are all characters who end up having massive impacts on where the franchise goes after said sequel, and who massively redefine what the franchise is in said sequel. Now, I think it's fairly obvious from that statement how I think Professor Paradox greatly impacts how I view Alien Force. Because from here on out, after Paradox's initial appearance, he will be playing a major role in all things cosmic or major to the plot in some small way, or at least should be based on how the writers set him up with knowledge of Ben's future achievements. In fact, even though I mentioned Yoda and all those other characters, I think the more obvious character to compare Paradox to would be the Architect in the second Matrix film, or maybe Palpatine from the Star Wars prequels, both of whom are characters that have knowledge/influence over the main character's destinies in ways that we, the audience, couldn't even begin to fathom, especially after coming out from the far different original/classic series depictions of them. I mean, come on, who could have predicted that after coming out of the first Matrix film, Neo being the chosen one would end up being some kind of elaborate scheme in order to further the Matrix's own goals? And who could have possibly foreseen just how exactly Palpatine manipulated Vader into becoming his apprentice? I mean, we barely knew anything about their relationship from the original trilogy, and while yes, it was implied Palpatine turned Vader in some way, based on what we saw in the original films, it was hard to predict just how deep those machinations were, and how savvy of a manipulator Palpatine was. I think Paradox fits into this role quite nicely, as he reveals and hints towards things about Ben's future that clearly imply a much different direction from that of the classic series. And again, this isn't a bad thing. What I'm trying to say here is that Paradox is setting up Alien Force being a more traditional sequel, just like how The Matrix 2 set up a very different situation and outcome for the third film compared to the first. So too do I believe Paradox set up a very different direction for the series going forward than it would have had with just the classic series in the back of our minds. And along with helping Alien Force truly stand out and change how audiences view it compared to how they viewed the classic series, Paradox is also just a really fun and unique character. I mean, come on, he's the living embodiment of the mystery box idea. Everything about him is mysterious and strange and makes you want to know more about him. But in a weird way, we also feel like we know him a little bit based on his interactions with Ben and the rest of the trio. We feel just like they do, a little off-put by this weird guy, but also slightly familiar with him. Oh, and speaking of Paradox's initial debut episode, I know Alien Force doesn't often get as much praise for its aesthetic and directing as the classic series does, but I really feel like that episode in particular did a great job of utilizing its visuals in a unique and abstract way to really help put us in the character's shoes and feel weirded out by this majestic and strange Paradox guy, which I think helped elevate the story a lot. I could honestly make a whole video about Paradox, but for now, in the interest of time, let's move on to the next segment of this video, where I want to talk about yet another thing that I believe Alien Force added to the overall franchise that helps it stand out from its previous iteration, and shows how it's not necessarily trying to be an MCU/direct sequel like we modern audiences have come to expect, but rather a more traditional sequel that doesn't really require any knowledge of the original to be good, and oftentimes tries to differentiate itself from the original in order to truly stand out in the franchise. And what is that thing that I'm talking about that Alien Force did? Well, it was its introduction of new villains that I think cemented Alien Force as a traditional sequel.
Why use your powers to help people when you can use them to get whatever you want?
While the first two seasons of Alien Force are mainly focused on the hybrid, and season 3 onward of Alien Force focuses on reintroducing old villains from the classic series, occasionally Alien Force did introduce brand new villains, and many of these new villains have gone on to become staples of the Ben 10 series as a whole, like Darkstar for example, who was so iconic that he made it into the reboot of the series, made by creators who never even saw Alien Force as a true sequel. That's how iconic these new villains became. One of my personal favorite new villains introduced in Alien Force is Albedo, because he's a unique twist on the typical evil version of the protagonist trope. How does introducing these new villains make Alien Force more like a classic sequel, you may ask? Well, much like how Fast and Furious 5 and 7 introduced two very iconic characters that shifted the trajectory of the series, I believe Alien Force's new villains did something similar. Darkstar, for example, is the first time ever that we truly shift away from the hybrid threat and focus on more human and psychotic threats throughout the entirety of Alien Force Season 1. And Albedo's episode brilliantly reintroduces Azimuth, while also building up to a conflict between Ben and this new evil version of himself. This is all very similar to Fast and Furious 5 and 7. Fast 5 had a villain who acted much like Darkstar did. He was mostly an antagonistic force that shifted the series from being all about car chases to being about heists and epic action sequences. 7 had a villain that was a dark reflection of Dom and Jason Statham's character, and shifted the series even more towards an action-oriented one, and built up an epic conflict between Dom and Jason Statham in the finale, much like how Albedo's episode built him up in its finale. I believe the introduction of these new villains once again represents how Alien Force is a more traditional old-school style sequel that introduces new conflicts and ideas personified in brand new villain characters and antagonists in order to truly test our heroes, whilst also still maintaining some continuity with the original, with the Albedo episode obviously obviously being with Azimuth being reintroduced, and Darkstar's episode once again focusing on Max going missing for the first half. Again, they're not completely independent of the classic series, but at the same time, they're nothing like what the classic series was doing, and are very, very different beasts.
Man, I don't recognize any of these guys. Well, here we go again.
Alright guys, this is the part of the video where I'm going to try to make sense of what I've been saying throughout this video, because I know I haven't been doing a very good job of that. Basically, when I first watched Alien Force, I went into it expecting a kind of MCU/modern day style sequel, where even the smallest and most innocuous seeming bits of continuity were brought back and made important to the plot in meaningful and substantial ways, and ended up unfairly comparing it to the original series, when in reality I should have been looking at Alien Force much differently, much like how I think people that view the classic series as a bad show due to its episodic nature kind of miss the point of what the series was going for. Now, yes, this is my fault. I'm not trying to blame anyone else here for that, but I do think that part of why I viewed Alien Force that way was because the fandom kind of treats Alien Force like that. True, nobody goes around saying, oh, it's basically like the MCU sequels, but I'd argue that when a new fan describes Alien Force, they almost always emphasize it being a sequel or a continuation of the classic series first, before talking about it like it's its own thing. And in my opinion, that's kind of a very bad way to look at Alien Force, because you're inevitably going to get people that compare it to the classic series, and disregard the fact that it's a completely different show aiming for a completely different style of storytelling. I've brought up a lot of examples of how I think Alien Force should be viewed, but I think the one big one I haven't talked about yet is Doctor Who. Yes, each Doctor continues the previous Doctor's story, but you'll never hear people say, oh, the 11th Doctor is a continuation of 9, 10, and all the ones before. No, he's just the 11th Doctor. He goes on his own series of adventures and quests, and occasionally continuity is brought in, but it's never the focal point. The goal isn't to be a long-running series like the MCU, it's simply to tell new and interesting stories with new and interesting doctors, and occasionally have continuity tie-in for older fans. I think this is a far better way of trying to sell Alien Force to new fans, so that way they don't inevitably end up doing what I did in my first video and compare it to classic and point out all the ways it's different, and end up thinking that it being different is bad / shouldn't be the main goal. Now, yes, I understand that this is a highly personal viewpoint of mine, and I also understand that this topic probably is pretty obvious to most of you guys. If so, I'm kinda sorry about that. Like I said in my community post, this video is either the best thing I ever did or the worst thing I ever did, and I'm starting to lean closer on worst thing I ever did, because I don't really like making objective statements like you should view things this way, since I understand art is subject to interpretation. But I can't help but feel that the way we talk about Alien Force and the rest of the Ben 10 sequels ends up inviting comparisons to one another, and like I said at the beginning of this video, comparison is the thief of joy. Don't believe me? Look at all the people that compare Omniverse to Ultimate Alien, or Alien Force to Ultimate Alien, or Alien Force to Omniverse, and say one is better than the other. Not only am I starting to feel like these conversations are incredibly reductive, but I'm also kind of starting to feel like having these conversations misses the point of what these shows were trying to do. That isn't to say you can't have a favorite show, or prefer one method of storytelling to the other. I just feel like comparing them, especially to modern day sequels, is robbing a lot of these conversations of their nuance and intricacies. But anyways guys, I think that's gonna have to be it for this video. If you're new around here, leave a like and subscribe, because I leave up a lot of community posts asking you guys what kind of videos you want to see. So if that interests you, you're gonna want to subscribe. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and it wasn't too vague or broad like I'm worried about it being, and that I actually managed to make a decent point at the end there. Feel free to comment your own thoughts on Alien Force in the comment section below. I'll see you guys in my next upload, which hopefully will be very soon.